Been talking a lot about the Beis Hamikdash as we do at this time of the year, and specifically about the third Beis Hamikdash. We spoke about how the first Beis Hamikdash had the advantage of the spiritual input from Hashem. The second Beis Hamikdash had the advantage of the human input, and the third Beis Hamikdash is supposed to be a collaboration of the two. Now the truth is that one of the things we saw is that there's a perspective which tells us that the Beis Hamikdash Hashlishi, the third Beis Hamikdash, is bonoi u'meshuchro l'maylo, that it's already prepared and it's ready on high, and when the time for Mashiach comes, it will descend. And we try to work out how you reconcile that with the fact that we're supposed to put in the effort in order for the Beis Hamikdash to be built. In other words, we'd physically build it, and we've spoken about different angles. Today we're going to look at a slightly different angle to what we've already discussed. There's no question about it that the primary experience of the third Beis Hamikdash, that means including the actual structure of the Beis Hamikdash, has mostly to do with Hashem. Yes, there will be an input from our side, we've already discussed that, but we need to revisit and understand what the nature of our input to the Beis Hamikdash will be. So one of the things we came across is that there's a principle: every time you do a mitzvah, it kind of, in a spiritual sense, creates a brick for that future Beis Hamikdash. In other words, how do we build that Beis Hamikdash? Let's go back in time. The first Beis Hamikdash was Hashem's initiative. That means that, yes, of course, we physically put together the bricks and mortar of it, but it was Hashem's initiative, which means that the energy flowed from Hashem, the power came from Hashem, and we were just, in a sense, putting together, like assembling the model. You know, you get given the instructions, and you put it all together, and then the model works. The second Beis Hamikdash was very much about our physical effort. So we physically schlepped from Babylon back to Jerusalem and found the materials and got the permissions and raised the funds, and then eventually we built the Beis Hamikdash. This third Beis Hamikdash, even though we will be involved in some element of its structure, our primary involvement actually in constructing this third Beis Hamikdash is what you and I are doing right now, and have been doing for the last close to 2,000 years, which is mitzvahs. So it's interesting because essentially our contribution to the third Beis Hamikdash may be a lot less about the physical labor. There will be an element that we physically build, but it will be primarily a gift from Hashem, however that's going to work. It reminds me of the story that the Gemara tells about, I think it was Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, who was very poor, and he wanted to make a contribution to the Beis Hamikdash. In those days, he lived at the time of the Beis Hamikdash, but he couldn't afford anything. You know, to contribute to the Beis Hamikdash, he had to give something of value. He couldn't afford anything. Anyhow, he found a very large boulder which he felt would be useful for, you know, every once in a while you had to do maintenance on the walls or whatever the case. He had this massive boulder, and he decided that's what he wanted to contribute to the Beis Hamikdash, except it was absolutely impossible for him to move this boulder, let alone carry it all the way to Jerusalem, up the hills, and it wasn't possible. So he didn't know what to do. So he leaned his shoulder against the rock and he started to push. And the Gemara says that shortly after that, a group of people appeared as if from nowhere, and they said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm trying to move this stone. I've got to get it to the Beis Hamikdash." "Oh, sure, we'll help you." And sure enough, they helped him carry it all the way to the Beis Hamikdash. And no sooner did they get there, they disappeared. So it was pretty clear that they were not of the human kind. So the message of that story is our job in life is not to complete processes. Our job is to start processes. So we have an obligation. The Torah tells us, do this. So you got to do it. You don't know how it's going to pan out. You don't know what's going to happen. You got to do what you got to do. So likewise, with the third Beis Hamikdash, it's kind of like the input that we'll have physically might very well be like putting your shoulder to the rock, and Hashem will assemble everything else. It's quite possible. But during the course of the period leading up to the time of Mashiach, that's actually when we build and structure this Beis Hamikdash. Actually, through our deeds. So every single person, whether you land up being on the construction team or not, every single person actually has a part to play in the building of that Beis Hamikdash. Now that's interesting then, because if we all have a part to play, you would assume then that the third Beis Hamikdash should be referred to in terms that speak about our part. But we don't. We tend to speak about it very much on Hashem's part. Hashem builds the Beis Hamikdash. That's very much the literature around the third Beis Hamikdash. And it's questionable to what extent we'll actually have a part to play. Some people say that all we'll contribute is literally just putting up the gates, and Mashiach will do, and Hashem will do the rest. So it's quite strange. If we've invested 2,000 years of input, of slog, of being committed to Judaism under the most adverse circumstances, you'd think would get some credit. You'd think at the end it would say the Beis Hamikdash that people built over the course of this collaborative effort of generations. No, we talk about the Beis Hamikdash that Hashem is going to build. How? How's that fair? How's that right? So there are two ways in which a person can do what they're supposed to do in life, generally, and in Judaism specifically. There's two ways. The one way that a person can do something is where it's driven by their own personal experience and their own personal interest. That means that every one of us likes to understand things, and every one of us likes to feel things. That's the nature of people. So if somebody had to arrive and tell you, this is what you got to do, for argument's sake, if somebody had to arrive and tell you, you have to lock yourself in your house and don't come out, and you can't buy alcohol, and if you do have to go anywhere, you should wear a mask. So the average person says, okay, listen, I understand that you're trying to quell an epidemic, but I don't understand why this is why is alcohol a part of it? Why are you banning alcohol? So that's the nature of people, right? We want to understand things. You speak to the guys who work in casualty in hospitals, you'll understand why we have to ban alcohol. We can't afford the resources in a country such as this to be wasted on people who come in with alcohol-related injuries. Okay, fine. So now you explain it to me. I understand it. I get it. I'll stockpile, or maybe I'll bootleg. But, we get the idea. The other thing about us is we like to feel things. It's very difficult to remain committed to do something if it doesn't really mean anything to you, if it doesn't talk to you, if you don't feel anything by doing it. Just going through the motions because this is what we're expected to do and this is what we're required to do. It's hard. I'm not saying we can't do something like that, but it's difficult to do something like that if you're not personally feeling the energy and the excitement or the value of what it is that you're doing. So the one way in which people come to do things in life and in Judaism specifically is you do what you understand and you do what you feel. That's why people often say, I'm inspired. That's why I'm going to do X and Y. And equally people say, I'm no longer inspired. I used to be inspired, but now I'm no longer inspired. So that's why I've stopped doing X and Y. That way of doing things makes the entire process and experience actually about ourselves. So that doesn't tell us how valuable the process is. It tells you how much we care about us. I understand it. That's why I'm doing it. I see the benefit. That's why I'm doing it. I feel the excitement. That's why I do it. So we don't know that that's actually doing what's right. It could just be doing what feels good. A higher, deeper way to do the right thing is with a sense of commitment to the fact that it's the right thing. As the Rambam famously says, Oise es ha'emes mipnei shehu emes. That the attitude of a Jewish person should not be, I'm going to do these mitzvahs because then I'll get X and Y as a reward from God. No, Oise es ha'emes, you do what is true because it is true. And everything else is detail. Likewise, when the Jews stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, they said, Na'aseh v'nishma. First we'll do, we're in, we're committed, no questions asked. Later on, you'll explain to us whatever you need to explain to us that will be relevant for us to know. We call this Kabbalas oil, to accept the authority of Hashem. In the Gemara it tells us that you start of Shema Yisrael, which is Kabbalas oil, the acceptance of Hashem's authority, and then you say, and you will love Hashem with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, which is what we call Kabbalas HaMitzvahs, commitment to actually do the mitzvahs. First comes Kabbalas oil. The first thing that you have to experience is dedication to Hashem. Now, if you look over the 2,000 years of Jewish exile, you will find those people who had a tremendous understanding of what Torah is about, and you'll find those people who had a very deep emotional connection with Torah. But you'll also find that the vast majority of people did what they had to do in spite of the fact that they didn't understand it, or they didn't feel it, or actually it felt like it was just going to be a big bother and maybe even a threat to their life. That's what's marked Jewish history, this phenomenal commitment of the Jewish nation to doing what Hashem wants because it's what Hashem wants, in spite of the fact that it might come at a tremendous cost. And we have so many stories of that, starting from the Roman occupation all the way to the communist regime. So therefore, it turns out that the majority of Jewish practice over the course of our history has been not so much about the Jew be coming from experiencing an intellectual connection, being uplifted emotionally, but it's primarily been about, I'm dedicated to God. My service is for Hashem's sake. And whether the person says it in as many words or just acts that way, it's pretty clear that there's this incredible sense of commitment. When you're committed to Hashem to such an extent, then Hashem counts that as if He's been doing the work. In other words, not just you with your limits as a human being, whatever a human being can achieve. Yes, a human being will enjoy learning and understanding, and a human being will enjoy things that he or she understands or feels. But at the end of the day, the limits of human intellect and emotion are such that if it's just on our terms, it actually doesn't necessarily go very far. So Hashem steps in and He says, all of the things that you've done, I'm going to consider it as the same scale and the same power as me doing it. So this Beis Hamikdash that will be built out of your efforts, I'm going to translate your efforts into my terms. So your efforts will carry the power, which is actually infinite power, as if I had built the Beis Hamikdash myself, even though it was actually you who was doing it. In other words, the third Beis Hamikdash will be testament to the fact that our commitment over the course of history hasn't just been the commitment at human capacity, it's been the commitment at infinite capacity. It's quite a thing to think about.